Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining this Distributed Generation Interconnection Collaborative webinar. My name is Eric Lockhart. I'm one of the co-leads for DGIC, along with Kelsey Horowitz, who's here today as well. We're excited for this timely discussion of distribution system upgrades to integrate DERs. So just for a basic agenda for today, I wanted to give just a little bit of brief background on DGIC and talk a little bit about what we've been up to in the past and things we're working on right now. I have a few logistics to cover, and then I'll turn it over to Kelsey and Justin for the presentations. And then, as always, we'll close out with a Q&A at the end. So just for some background on the Distributed Generation Interconnection Collaborative, some of you may have heard this before if you've tuned in for past webinars, but the program here at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is supported by the DOE Solar Energy Technologies Office, or CETO, and it was launched back in 2013 following a stakeholder workshop that identified a need for such a collaborative. And I just have highlighted there that we've had around 20 webinars conducted to date over that period, alongside a number of publications and other things that we can talk about as well. So DGIC is intended to be stakeholder driven and properly a collaborative. So our hope is that the content that we pull together for you all reflects what we're hearing from participants to be priorities in the broader DER interconnection space. So the area 2 there just sort of speaks to some of the mechanisms for getting the word out and connecting with people. So there's mechanisms for data and information exchange, including these webinars, and our hope is that this exchange will advance the conversation on some of these important interconnection topics in an ever-changing world for interconnection and increasing DER penetration. So I mentioned it a little bit in the last slide there, but we were sort of organized around 2 primary pillars. We have practices and protocols and peer exchange. So the practices and protocols area captures documenting practices, innovation, research, et cetera, that DGIC pulls together with the hopes of supporting future discussion and replicating things that are working in different jurisdictions. We also hope to identify where there are data gaps and sort of share situational awareness of different issues that utilities are dealing with in the DER interconnection space. And the second pillar is really a part and parcel of the first, and I mentioned it a bit before already, that it's critical to facilitate this peer exchange aspect of the program. And there's some lessons learned, which we have in quotes, because so much of what we discuss is really nascent and emergent practices that maybe are a stage too early to be described as best practices. We have the DGIC website, which may have been how some of you found this webinar. And we also hold in-person workshops where the opportunity arises. Just last month, we held a half-day workshop at DEPA's Grid Evolution Summit. So here's just a few upcoming things here. So we have a couple more upcoming webinars in the next few months, one on DER aggregation and one on EV charging networks and pilots. We have a few blog posts that are in the works now, one on comparing effectiveness of STATCOMs and advanced inverters and high penetration settings with a look at some jurisdictions in Australia, one on cost allocation, and one on solar plus storage interconnection. For those of you who've been on prior webinars, this guidebook to DER interconnection will be familiar, that will seek to document practices across a suite of different categories of DER interconnection issues. We have an upcoming publication on the role of pre-application reports in improving DG interconnection processes with a focus on Massachusetts experience with pre-application reports. And then I just included on here this recently held workshop at DEPA's Grid Evolution Summit. Okay, so a few quick logistics before we turn to the presentations. At any point throughout the discussion here, please feel free to type questions into the questions pane that you should see on the right-hand side. And I'll also mention if you have any trouble hearing or seeing slides, you can use the chat window for that too. So we'll monitor questions on an ongoing basis and then collect them together for the Q&A as well. And I mentioned at the bottom here that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the DGI website along with these slides to review later and share with other folks who might have missed it today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey first and then Justin. We've got Kelsey Horowitz here from NREL as well, and as I mentioned, she's the co-lead for DGIC, and she's been focusing on this particular issue for some time now. And we're lucky enough to have Justin Woodard on the line as well as a principal engineer in the New Energy Solutions Group at National Grid, and he's based in Massachusetts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelsey.
Hi, thanks, Eric, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. I'm going to kick this off with some introduction to the topic of upgrades for integrating DER and distribution networks, and then hand it over to Justin Woodward from National Grid, who will give some insights on their experiences with these issues. So first, why would you potentially need to upgrade the distribution system in order to accommodate DER? In this particular webinar, we're actually focusing specifically on distributed PV, just because that's a topic that has more sort of information and knowledge around how to integrate it onto these networks at this point, more experience. And then we'll also be touching a little bit on storage and its potential role with distributed PV. So there are a few different effects that have been observed from distributed PV on distribution networks. These include voltage impacts, like high or low voltages, and voltage flickers, so variability in the voltage on the system. Thermal overloads on distribution lines or transformers. Issues with protection, protection coordination, for example, or anti-islanding. And reverse power flow. And since these networks weren't set up for reverse power flow, that can lead to issues with operation of devices on the grid. And in some cases, people have also started to see some backfeed at the substation. So here's an example that I'm showing for a feeder that's publicly available feeder from EPRI called the J1 feeder, and it's in the northeastern United States. So you can see the profile for the voltage on the left when there's no PV present, and then after they had two large PV systems connected to the distribution network, they saw the voltage pushed up outside of the ANSI limits and observed a violation in terms of their overvoltage on the system that they needed to mitigate. And voltage impacts are sort of one of a class of different observed impacts, as I just mentioned, and there's been some studies trying to understand the distribution of impacts that have been seen in practice during the interconnection process. So this is mostly for larger PV systems that are commercial systems connected to the distribution network, so from a few hundred kilowatts to several tens of megawatts. So pretty large. This isn't really for residential, smaller scale distributed PV systems. One of these was a report on SGIP interconnection studies. They looked at 100 different studies, and this was performed by Sandia and included a review of interconnection reports from PNM, APS, PacifiCorp, and PJM. Out of all the reports that they reviewed, they saw that 56 had adverse impacts from the interconnection of these larger PV systems, and 44 had no adverse impacts. And then you can see in the pie chart below here the distribution of different impacts that were observed. So there's a split between voltage, protection, and thermal impacts, and in some cases multiple impacts were observed. And then in another review focused on the Western United States by NREL and the Western Interstate Energy Board, or WEEB, that was published this year, they reviewed 92 different PV system interconnection applications in the Western United States, and similarly saw a distribution between thermal impacts, protection impacts, and voltage impacts, with maybe voltage impacts being a little more common along with thermal impacts than protection in those cases. So how are these issues that may need to be mitigated typically identified? a PV project usually applies for an interconnection application, and that's what this figure, this flow chart is showing here. After that, they go through a different set of screening and review processes depending on the characteristics of the system. So they can include fast track screens, supplemental review screens, more detailed impact studies, and then the utility does modeling and suggests solutions for mitigating the impacts, if any are observed. This can be kind of an expensive process involving detailed study for certain systems. And then after the system has gone through this full interconnection process, the utility recommends things like upgrades that may be required to the system to mitigate any impacts, or changes to the PV plant itself. So changing the size of the PV, for example, decreasing the size so that the impact is no longer observed, or suggesting modifications to the PV inverter set points that can help mitigate some of those issues as well. So this is a typically project-specific process. There have been some attempts, which I'll talk about later, to implement a group study process where several groups of systems applying for interconnection at a similar time are studied together, but a lot of times this is still done on a single system basis, and it doesn't really consider future PV deployment. So you can see that these recommended changes to mitigate these impacts can include system upgrades, but also changes to the PV plant itself. And the cost of these can vary very significantly depending on the feeder and the characteristics of the PV and the other PV that are already on the network. So what I'm showing on this slide is the distribution of total interconnection costs for mitigating any effects that were observed on the network for the SGIP study and the WEEB study that I mentioned on the previous slides. And you can see these range from 0 up until $1.4 per watt, which is a pretty significant portion of the overall system cost in some cases. And a lot of times these tend to be more on the order of 0 to 20 cents a watt based on these two studies. And a lot of these costs are driven by thermal impacts or network expansion. So those are the upgrades that are more expensive to mitigate typically in practice on average. And then voltage and protection impacts tend to be a little bit less expensive to mitigate on average. So if you don't have to do network expansion or reconductoring or replace large transformers, the costs tend to be lower. And then something that's interesting is you can see the different voltage mitigation strategies that were taken in the SGIP report. So this is sort of a mix of traditional solutions like installing new voltage equipment or changing the settings on existing voltage equipment, upgrading conductors, and then in some cases suggesting a change to the power factor for the PV inverter, as I mentioned just a minute ago. So there may be other options for people to consider both when planning for distribution upgrades and different technology solutions that may be available for mitigating any issues that arise outside of that sort of traditional set of upgrades. So for example, eventually you can think about having this more integrated into the utility planning process so that you can map out upgrades that may be required as a function of penetration level with some understanding or projection of what the future DER or DPV on that network might look like, and then map out sort of costs for mitigating any issues that arise beyond the hosting capacity. And this may be really useful because you could look at solutions that may have a higher upfront cost, but then eventually be a lower cost pathway to get to either the penetration that you're expecting to be adopted on your system just economically, or if you have a target as a utility to get to a certain level. But there are a lot of questions involved in this, like how does this relate to broader grid modernization efforts? How can interconnection and planning departments be more coordinated? How do you predict the levels of penetration or adoption on your system? How do you allocate the cost of different upgrades if they benefit broad sets of projects? And then how can you actually do modeling and simulation to assess these upgrades when you need a significant amount of high quality data and software? So other things that people can do sort of short of this complete overhaul of the planning process is look at options like doing a group study where you consider multiple PV applications at once that are in the queue for a certain circuit. This has been implemented or is being implemented in a few different areas. For example, in California through their Rule 21. You could think about preemptively upgrading a circuit in order to increase the hosting capacity where you expect there to be lots of DER interconnected in the future, and then socialize the cost of those upgrades. You could use hosting capacity analysis in order to try to drive the location of DPV into areas that are low cost or low impact or high value. And also establish interconnection practices and procedures that allow DPV plants to be good citizens of the grid. So this would be, instead of doing system-wide upgrades, upgrading the DPV plants themselves, for example, through the use of smart inverters or storage. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Justin, and he can provide some highlights from their experiences with some of these different processes and technologies at National Grid.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'll try and keep this entertaining. I was just realizing, depending where you are, this might be, the last thing you do before lunch. You may be eating lunch, or maybe just after lunch. So we'll try and keep it entertaining here. If we can. There we go. Advance the slide. So Justin Woodard from National Grid, principal engineer, and I've done a lot of work in our company-owned solar program. So we have deployed 3 phases of solar, and I've been involved with making sure that they meet our objectives. As I'll highlight. I start with just a little bit of information about National Grid. We're an investor-owned utility in the Northeast, in New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And I like this graph. It's a little dated, but it does show you that we have a large increase in renewable generation in our service territory. So all the things that are being discussed here are really near and dear to our customers and the work that we're undertaking. Our interconnection process, very similar to, I don't know the slide number here, but it was the one where we're going over, the traditional, you get the application and see if you can fast track. We have a simplified and expedited for smaller systems. Residential systems follow a different path, but systems that are standalone and 500 kilowatts follow what we try and do is a simplified path for larger projects. Depending on the system upgrades needed, they may include kicking that to our more detailed study. And I think it's interesting, most utilities probably look at this list and shake their heads and nod, that there's a lot to the interconnection, and we've been trying to streamline that even internally of how do you link all of these different departments together to try and move the interconnection queue along in as expedient of a process as possible. So, just an interesting, aside that there's the overall interconnection process, and then there's the getting all the information, making sure that the records are updated, and all that internal interdependencies that we work on to try and help get customers through the interconnection process as quickly as possible, and then get the systems up and running. Interesting, we do group studies already. So when multiple customers are connecting on a single feeder, we'll give the option to do a group study and try and get all of those systems moving along rather than taking it in a serial process where it'll be the first customer goes through, does a study, and then the second. We do find that definitely helps. Just thought it would be good to talk about some of our limitations. I always find this is an interesting discussion point that, in general, in our feeders, which depends what service area you're in Massachusetts, most of our feeders are on the shorter side, and with that, we can take in put on 4 to 5 megawatts without major upgrades. In some cases, we do install dedicated feeders for renewables, and you can see that on a larger system where that may be done on a 13 kV class, which is a majority of our system is the 15 kV class. We'll actually put upwards of 14 megawatts on a single dedicated feeder if the conditions are right. So a lot of penetration in our area. With that, we're seeing a large need for 3V0, so upgrading our substation transformers with protection so that we can have reverse power flow. Interestingly enough, another thing not on this slide, but I like to put it in people's minds is food for thought, that in substation transformers, first thing is 3V0, so we're protecting them if they're backfeeding. But if they're backfeeding, they're really more of a generator step-up transformer. And we actually have instances where we have 20, 30 MVA substation transformers that are approaching their nameplate capacity on backfeed. And we haven't yet, to my knowledge, upgraded one, but the thought of upgrading a substation transformer to allow more backfeed definitely signs of high penetration. And whether you try and spec a generation step-up transformer at that case. So interesting thoughts there of how you start dealing with this higher penetration. As I was saying, 3V0 is something we're seeing a lot of, and we have a policy that the last customer who triggers the upgrade pays for the upgrade, so that helps keep the cost lower for a majority of the customers. And then as that penetration increases and that upgrade is needed, the customer that triggers that upgrade and certain customers therefore after are the ones that pay and cost share that upgrade. So we're thinking as a company of how do we start to try and proactively do these upgrades, build into our standards, and think about new ways to cost share that because it becomes tricky. Customers after are required to cost share, and then we have to refund that customer who paid for it. And that's an accounting practice. It has nothing to do with the electrical interconnection, but an accounting practice that we find that we have to keep track of, and there's a lot of work associated with that. So again, thinking about things that are related, but maybe indirectly.
And Justin, while you're switching slides there, I'll remind everybody to type their questions into the question pane as they come up. And somebody just had a quick question of what 59N relaying is.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you for raising that. So a 59N relay is a it's really seen in ground fault. So if we have a step-up transformer, so we're generating on our distribution system, power is flowing through the substation out to the transmission side. If there's a line-to-ground fault on the transmission system, that transformer that's feeding into that fault needs to isolate and stop providing current, short-circuit current, into that fault. And that's what that relay is really used for. It's a protection means for the transmission system. Historically, power would flow over the transmission system out through the distribution substation into the customers, so that this was never needed because power could never flow backwards. But now that it can, we're looking at upgrading that more and more and building that into our standards. So yeah, thank you for that question. All right, technical issues. So I think this is just a good list that very much aligns with a lot of the data that we were seeing earlier. These are just some of the different things: voltage, thermal, and flicker. Obviously, something we've had to model and definitely include in our studies. So getting to National Grid's vision, we really want to be able to help move from what we term interconnection to integration. So how do we get or leverage distributed generation to improve, and I like the term, be better stewards of the grid. So that's a lot of our work in our different solar programs, is understanding the capacity, capability of those systems, and how do they line us up, to promote future growth and, peak reductions, both in summer and winter. So we are a summer peaking area, or in a summer peaking area, although because of our generation mix being natural gas, a lot of natural gas, there's some winter constraints. So, definitely seeing that on both sides. How do we leverage distributed generation and then adding in storage to help balance some of those needs? So that's kind of our vision, and we've given a lot of work to think about how do we actually get to the slide to move forward. There we go. Thinking about what we need to get there, and how do we leverage different technologies and integrate them together. So, for example, we've been working with VVO, volt-var optimization, so leveling the voltage across the feeder to reduce customers' consumptions and reduce the system peak. So how do we tie that with advanced inverters and really be able to maybe leverage the data in to control capacitors, or on the other side, take some of the information we may have and then use the advanced inverters to deliver some VARs to better balance the voltage to reduce the demand. So that's an area where we're looking to try and figure out that linkage between volt-var optimization and advanced inverters. Obviously, energy storage is a key component there. I think a lot of different utilities are seeing an increase. We definitely are in some of our service territories seeing a large increase in energy storage systems. One other interesting note is azimuth shift. So depending on the amount of PV penetration, there can be a benefit to pointing the systems further west, in our case, to better align the output of the system, the peak output of the system, to our regional demand peak. So by moving those systems and pointing those systems a little further west, we make the generation of those systems during our peak hours, which tends to be 4 to 6, a little more, so that we get a better peak reduction from the PV. And that's another benefit of a tracking system. Not a lot of people think about tracking systems in the sense of providing demand, but you get the benefit of the demand reduction, and you don't lose any energy from the azimuth shift. That's the unfortunate flip side to that, is when you go off a 180 or due south azimuth, your total energy produced over the year does start to go down a little. So there is a trade-off there that tracking doesn't have to pay. It doesn't have that trade-off, so definitely an interesting area. Now, National Grid, I mentioned several phases of solar. Really, I'll pick up with our Phase 2 program. You may be able to guess our first program was Phase 1, and the third program was Phase 3, duly named by an engineer. So in our Phase 2 program, we look to leverage advanced inverters. So I'm glad to say now we've been able to deploy those, and we're working on picking the best settings. So really understanding of the 16 megawatts or 18 sites that we've deployed, how and what functions do we use to benefit the feeder. So there's a lot of Oh, volt var, it's a great function. It is, but knowing the settings and knowing where that site is really has an impact on, the ramp rate you may put that at and some of the functions. So we do see advanced inverters being very beneficial. And, this program, said all the systems are up and running, and we've figured out what we think is the best settings. We're in the process of putting those through or putting those out to the systems and actually seeing the results. Now, our phase 3 program, a little later in the timeline, this was launched last year. So it builds upon the advanced inverters with what we call enhancements. So as I mentioned, tracking is being an enhancement to just azimuth shifting. We continue the advanced inverter functionality because we just see that being very important. And then also energy storage as an enhancement. So our phase 3 site, which is under construction, we don't have any of the systems up and running and ready for testing yet, but we have 14 megawatts, most of which is under construction. Interestingly enough, we do have a site. We expect it's around a 1.5 megawatt PV plant with a static VAR compensator, advanced inverters, and storage. So that's on a 23 kV loop line, so it feeds many stations and many customers. And that's really exciting for us, is to have all of that technology, especially when I mentioned volt VAR optimization, is understanding how that static VAR compensator can supplement energy storage and or the PV advanced inverter to really give us improved power quality and reduced demand on that section of feeder. Advanced facilities, it's worthwhile just, what is an advanced facility? So it's a facility that has the capability of advanced inverter functions that we can communicate with and is monitored. So this diagram, you'll see there's a plant controller there, which is a really crucial part of that system and connects those different components. So in that case of the system where I said we have, the DVAR, the static VAR compensator, how does it know to select which unit? And is it, VARs from the storage? Is it VARs from the inverter? And knowing what the total system is doing. So that's where the plant master controller. So to us, you can have an advanced inverter. That doesn't make it an advanced facility. And that plant master controller is a real important component of making that facility capable of really being a better steward of the grid. And the capabilities are listed. And they say they are a lot of what you tend to expect when you hear advanced inverters. I won't read through them all, but the different curves and settings of those become a really important factor of the advanced inverter functions. Thinking a little bit more, on lessons learned, inverters are really capable. And this is a picture of a test where you can see this pink line is moving and an inverter is producing full reactive power. And within a cycle, it goes from lagging to leading. So absorbing to actually leading. And it's really impressive to think that that technology exists, that this inverter can do that on the fly. But understanding how that works with a larger system, so that plant master controller, is really an important aspect. So when I get thinking about lessons learned and what I think what can go wrong, when you put in settings, you may expect that things react in a certain amount of time. Well, here, for one of our control systems, you put in a setting and you think, okay, I'm going to put in some VAR injection, and I send the command. So we're all set. But what really happens in the field? And that's where this plant master controller getting good power quality data is really important. So that was another thing that we learned is getting power quality meters at the sites and understanding exactly what those advanced inverter functions are doing on the system. So taking it from just an inverter level to a full plant level. And here, when we have a volt var function, you turn it on, it sees a certain voltage, so it's going to react with a certain amount of vars. So then the voltage drops because you are taking and reducing that by absorbing some vars, and then it sees that voltage drop, and then the voltage, or the system calculates, oh, I need to stop absorbing vars because the voltage is low, and then the voltage jumps up, and you end up with this ringing. So what you thought was an increase to your power quality or your voltage profile by turning on an advanced inverter function really ends up being a detriment to power quality on the system. So luckily, this isn't a hard problem to solve. It's really just having good feedback from the plant master controller and applying the proper delays and making sure that the system doesn't ring is really important. So that leads me to a trivia question for the day, and that is, when in New England do you think is the best time to test these functions? And the answer there is any time but the winter time. So this is actually one of our sites when we went to go do some of our advanced inverter testing, and you can see we got a little snow there in February. So I always throw that out there. If you're doing testing in the Northeast, you should try not to target February. Now that phase 2, and I mentioned we are in the initial recommendation setting area of this graph. So we went through, we looked at the sites, we did a lot of the modeling and predictions of where do we think the inverters could improve, or the advanced facilities could improve the grid. And we tried to just come with out of the box settings. So that was our methodology in this process. And then we went to, okay, we're going to take those recommendations and we're going to put those in there and look at the difference between the baseline and the out of the box settings. That's where we are in our facilities. We're working with EPRI. We've installed a bunch of power quality monitors on feeders to try and really quantify the benefits. So there'll be some more reports out on that, and stay tuned. There's actually a link at the end of the deck with all of the reports and where you can find that. So that's one area we see really being important, is understanding how do we best utilize the facilities, because the technology is going to be there, but how do we really take and get those facilities equipped to be better stewards of the grid. And also, one thing we found interesting through our research is understanding what the conditions are. So in order to be a better steward, you kind of need to know what's happening on the feeder. So when you can start to quantify the number of days and different characteristics that you're seeing in an area, that really helps understand the function that you'd want to enable. So getting just weather data and trying to quantify what that looks like in a certain area that you may be in can be beneficial in understanding what functions you want to target with the advanced inverters or other mitigation methods. This is just another view of that data. But it's interesting when you put it into a month view, you can really start to see, all right, what are my, how many problematic days? What do those shapes look like? Do those start to align with peak days, and understanding what your generation profile may look like and how PV could supplement or be beneficial to that. Also, I can speak personally from my experience with building solar that as a utility, we tried to really leverage different learnings that we've had as a utility and put that into the facilities to really reduce the total cost. Luckily, as a utility, we're really able to think about the system through to its end of life. And how do we maybe spend or design a facility today that really reduce that total ownership cost and make it a better facility. One thing that we recently did was do arc flash testing. So DC arc flash testing in PV arrays. While there's many ways to calculate it, we're not able to find any real world data. And we believe that what we were seeing was conservative models requiring us to put on more than our normal 8 cal DC arc flash clothing. So that doing some operations required people to put on pretty heavy clothing, and working in the summer really became tedious and took longer to get facilities back up. So we went and did some testing to really understand that there is a certain risk and how to make sure that we're addressing that properly. So there's a link to, or at least I think there's, we'll check on the next slide. If not, we'll get that updated in the slides. Link to the DC arc flash report that shows that there's definitely some over analysis by some models of DC arc flash. So other things is leveraging from substation transformer or substation construction, having documents on site so that when you go to do maintenance, you have all that information. Just standard things of keying and maintenance, housekeeping. Spacing between rows is one that was really interesting for us. As you do maintenance on the site, you need to go to all the combiner boxes and shut the system off. And typically the system's designed with a combiner box in the middle, and there's no gap in the rows for you to walk down. So when someone was going to do maintenance, they literally have to walk to the end of the row, up a few, back to the end of the other row, up, back, when they really only needed to go 20 feet between combiner boxes. They were walking hundreds of feet. So by just putting a gap in the row, someone was able to reduce the time to shut down the system and safely do work by 2, 3, 4x. So that was a really beneficial improvement. So here's some of those reports. Sorry, get the slide to move. All right. Yep, here's that EPRI Advanced Inverter white paper and some other links to National Grid and the Smart Inverter paper. So those are all good references. The Smart Grid Ready PV Inverter is some of our previous work, while the top link there is the link to the report where we're talking about the initial settings and how we chose those in the research thus far. So with that, we'll see if Eric has any questions.
Great. Yeah, and we can just leave your contact info up there while we're doing Q&A, so people can take it down. And I'll mention, I think I mentioned at the outset that we'll be sharing a recording of this webinar and these slides on the DGIC website. So all those links that Justin just talked through will be available for you to peruse on your own time as well. All right. I don't know, Kelsey, do you want to start with the first question here?
Sure, yeah, and there are some questions coming in. Encourage people to continue submitting those questions into the question box of the webinar, and we'll keep answering them as we get them. So I think one question that we had early on was, why is backfeed of power an issue, and what is the impact on transformers, PARs, et cetera?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about that correctly, is why is backfeed a problem? And it really depends on what piece of equipment. So the system traditionally was designed for flow in one direction for the most part. So when we start introducing this distributed generation, especially on our distribution system, networks that are feeding residential homes, the power will start to move in an opposite direction, so from the solar facility back towards the substation, and it changes the voltage profile. So that's our first challenge with Backfeed, is understanding how we need to change our voltage regulation settings so that we now go from a state where the highest voltage would have been at the source of the substation and the lowest voltage would have been at the far end of the feeder. That now may be reversed, where the highest voltage may be at the PV plant at the end of the facility or the feeder, and the lowest voltage would need to be at the substation because all of that power is coming back to the substation. So that's our first challenge with Backfeed. And then the protection that's associated with taking that energy, going through the substation transformer and getting it out onto a transmission system. So if the substation didn't have the proper protection, because when it was designed, 50, 80 years ago, they were just designing it for taking energy off of the transmission system and sending it out to the distribution system, that wouldn't have been, included as, protection that was needed because they just didn't think about it then. So those are my two main examples of why Backfeed can be a challenge.
Great, thank you. All right, another question we have is, when there is a 3V0 upgrade, how many customers after the one who triggered it are eligible for cost sharing? And I know you mentioned, it sounds like in some cases there may be cost sharing, in other cases maybe you still under the cost causer model. So maybe if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. So as the penetration is increasing, we have a certain, it's called feeder, and the need for 3V0 is only when we feel that there's a condition that can arise that would allow Backfeed onto the transmission system. So we don't actually require it just on any generation. We actually have a formula that factors in contingencies and a lot of light load and high generation. So we factor that all in, and we come up with certain thresholds for when there's a certain amount of generation where we need to install 3V0. So customers can install up to that amount of generation without incurring the cost for that upgrade. Once a customer comes along that puts us over that, and we're not necessarily talking residential, 10 kilowatt, we're talking hundreds of kilowatts, 500 kilowatt, 1 megawatt systems. Once a system comes along that puts us over that threshold, they would be required to pay for the 3V0. And then customers that come in of a certain threshold, size threshold, afterwards, and I believe it's time. I'll be honest, I forget the nuance there. I think it's 3 years. After that, then would be required to pay a portion of that cost to be reimbursed to the first customer who bears the cost. We are looking to change that. As I said, it becomes very problematic, so we're proactively thinking about how can we just go and say, all right, here's the total capacity on this feeder, and if a customer wants to put in a megawatt, and it requires 3V0, but we know there's going to be 3 more megawatts available on that feeder after that upgrade is complete, that we would only charge that customer, a quarter of the cost for the 3V0 upgrade, and then be able to just have that ready, and when customers would come in after that, say, all right, you just have to pay this share depending on your size, would really simplify the cost share, eliminates the cost share, and really simplifies the interconnection. So that's where we're looking to go in the future with the cost share.
Okay, great. And we have several different questions around advanced inverter functions. So questions on what settings for the inverters you're considering or using for voltage support, for example, volt var, volt watt, fixed power factor change? And then are these settings required for any different customer groups, and in particular for net energy metering customers? And then I guess a sort of related question is, are you requiring UL 1741 SA listed inverters, and how does that sort of play into this?
So maybe I'll take that in reverse order because yes, we're requiring or the new IEEE standard. So we're not necessarily requiring SA. And again, maybe I'll just caveat that this is the construction. So when we're talking about the interconnection requirements, it's just my recollection. It's not actually. I don't have the policy in front of me. So my understanding is that we're going to be requiring the new IEEE standard, not necessarily SA. To the second part of that question, we don't presently require it in most cases. So I say most cases because when a customer comes to interconnect, we're not in the business of saying no. We're in the business of saying what it's going to take to actually interconnect them. So if they come in with, X megawatts, we're going to look and find out how do we interconnect that facility. And part of that may be saying, all right, you could reduce the size and reduce the cost. You might be able to, if voltage regulation is an issue, we'll think about that advanced inverter and we'll offer that, but not having the data yet, which we're close to, and being able to say, all right, we know for sure that utilizing these settings in this environment allows us to increase the amount of generation. So that's where I say we're not, in some cases we're not mainstream there. And to the first part of that question on what settings, we're really not limiting ourselves to, per se, any settings. My best, and that gets in, probably spend a whole webinar based on just advanced inverter settings. I'd really encourage to look at the paper we have with EPRI, and that walks through all the settings we looked at and why we're picking those settings out of the box and the unique feeder characteristics along with those settings. So great question, many parts. Hopefully I answered it, and I think that EPRI paper will hopefully provide some insights on the settings we looked at.
Okay, great. And then there was another couple questions around curtailment. So you had a slide where you'd mentioned real power curtailment sort of briefly. There's some questions around how or if you're implementing this now, and then if you need any kind of upgrade to your system to be able to implement that, and maybe if there are any reactions from developers on the curtailment risk.
Sure. So that has been a huge benefit of us being able to develop and own these systems, is that we haven't had to go to developers to say, we want to test this, we're going to curtail your system, and having to try and find a mechanism for reimbursing them and all that concern. So for us, this has been a huge benefit that we can go and do this testing. We're free to update the facilities however we think that they provide the testing results or benefit to the grid. To date, we really haven't used power curtailment. We've talked about trying to tie it in with a feeder monitor so that we could avoid potentially needing a 3V0 upgrade. So at the head end of the feeder, looking at the energy and saying, okay, as the system or generation starts coming back, when can we actually curtail the system and avoid the need for 3V0? We didn't get too far because, unfortunately, the way that works is the next system that goes in and actually puts in an upgrade, or as the more systems come in, you're curtailing more and more, and that becomes problematic, and the development community is not really interested in a lot of curtailing. So to date, we really haven't used power curtailment, but we have it if we can start to see a good use for it.
Okay, great. And the one other question that we had, and I'm not sure if there's a good rule of thumb for this or not, but just understanding around what % of PV penetration you're starting to see substation transformers overloaded, if you've been seeing that on your system.
We're approaching 100% in some cases of loading, nameplate loading capacity in reverse power flow, and it's only on certain days. But there's a certain area of our system that's in a certain load zone that's beneficial, where the land is inexpensive relative to other areas. So it means that we've seen a huge amount of PV penetration in a certain area of our system. So there's a few substations in that area, and one of them normally backfeeds almost any given day. Probably right now it's backfeeding. There's other areas that under the right conditions, when loading is light, on a Saturday or Sunday when manufacturing or industrial load is light, we'll see lots of generation on the feeder, and we're starting to approach a point where it's 100% of its rating in backfeed.
Okay. I guess this is kind of a follow-up question to that. Are you guys concerned about the overloading of transformers for temporary periods of time? You mentioned this just happens, certain days under certain loading conditions. If it's just for a short period of time, is that something that you're looking at options for upgrading those transformers, or are you okay with operating an overload for a certain period if you have like a cool down between those periods?
Yeah, that's another good question, and I don't know. I think they're looking at that and trying to figure out what the cool down period would be overnight and loading. Luckily, I don't think we've actually had a problem there, because I think the feeders are also capacity, so it means a pretty massive upgrade in that area. So I know we have an engineering team looking at that. I don't know what their results are, allowing any more distributed generation on that substation.
Okay. And so we also had a follow-up question on the real power curtailment issue. It sounds like maybe you guys haven't really implemented this yet, but if you did, don't know if you were planning on sort of recording the amount of curtailment and sharing it with the system owner or National Grid. And I kind of in a somewhat related question to that, just if you could provide some perspective on how the different solutions that you're considering or have implemented, including potentially real power curtailment, or you mentioned bulk bar optimization as well, relate to other system monitoring and communications upgrades, and maybe like an ADMS type system.
Yeah, and that's something we're in the process of scoping out, is a new energy or we call it energy management system, EMS, but yes, a new ADMS, and how do we integrate all of that information in. So it's something we're looking at. We really haven't gotten there. And we do, if you just Google National Grid Solar, you'll see we have our phase 1 sites. We're working on getting all our phase 2 sites up there and having all of the information so you can see if they're curtailed. But we don't yet have like a report to see, how much energy was lost because of said function. But it, would be part of our study to try and understand or quantify the total energy lost by utilizing any of the advanced inverter functionality.
Okay, great. I know we're coming up towards the end of the hour, so thank you all very much for your time. I think we got to most of the questions, but not quite all of them. So if you have additional questions, you can also email us, and then the slides and the recording of the webinar will be posted. So if you missed something that was said earlier, you can always go back and listen to that again when it's posted on the DGIC website. And thank you all very much for your time, and thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
All right, take care.